The moment the arrogant flight attendant mocked Manny Pacquiao in front of an entire cabin full of passengers, everyone on board froze. It wasn't just what she said, but the way she said it, dripping with arrogance as if she enjoyed making someone feel small. What she didn't realize was that the man she was insulting was not only one of the greatest boxers in history, but also someone deeply respected for his humility and compassion. And within minutes, her careless words would cost her the very job she was so proud of. Before we continue with this powerful story, tell us where you're watching from right now. And if you enjoy stories about courage, dignity, and unexpected twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another special story waiting just for you. Now, back to the flight that no one on board would ever forget. All started as an ordinary journey. Manny Pacquiao, dressed simply in jeans and a plain shirt, boarded the plane quietly. Unlike many celebrities, he didn't travel with an entourage or demand special treatment. He preferred to blend in, just another passenger like everyone else. That's always been his way. Despite his fame, despite his wealth, he never let it change who he truly was. A humble man from General Santos City who knew the value of respect. But sometimes, humility can be mistaken for weakness. And that day, the flight attendant made that very mistake. From the moment Manny asked a simple question about his seat, she rolled her eyes. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, as if she was dealing with someone beneath her. At first, Manny stayed calm, smiling politely. But when she raised her voice and made a cutting remark loud enough for others to hear, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers glanced at each other, whispering, "Who was this flight attendant talking to like that? And why was she being so cruel?" Little did they know, the man sitting quietly in front of them had faced insults far harsher in his life, and had turned every single one of them into motivation. This moment would be no different. What happened next stunned everyone on that flight. To understand why this ordinary flight turned into such an extraordinary moment, you first need to know who Manny Pacquiao really is. To millions around the world, he's known as Pac-Man, the 8-division world champion who shocked the boxing universe with his speed, power, and relentless determination. But behind the titles, the belts, and the fame lies something far more remarkable, a man who never forgot where he came from. Born into poverty in the southern Philippines, Manny's childhood was anything but easy. He grew up in a small, humble home, often going hungry and working from a very young age to support his family. Shoes were a luxury, and school was a privilege he couldn't always afford. But what he lacked in material wealth, he made up for in heart. Fighting wasn't just a sport for him, it was survival. Every punch he threw was a step closer to putting food on the table and giving his family hope. As the years went by, his talent carried him out of the streets of General Santos City and into the brightest lights of the boxing world. He defeated champions, broke records, and became a national hero. Yet through all the fame and fortune, one thing about Manny never changed: his humility. He still carried himself like the boy who once sold bread on the streets to earn a few coins. Whether meeting presidents, celebrities, or ordinary fans, he always treated people with kindness and respect. And that's why the events on that flight were so shocking. Because if there's one thing Manny values above all else, it's respect. On this particular day, Manny was traveling alone. No flashy suit, no luxury watch, no sign that he was one of the most famous athletes on the planet. Just jeans, a button-up shirt, and a quiet presence. Most passengers didn't even realize who he was, and Manny preferred it that way. He boarded the plane like any other traveler, carrying only a small bag and offering a polite smile to the staff as he entered. But sometimes, appearances can be deceiving. The flight attendant assigned to his section was known for her strict, sometimes harsh demeanor. Colleagues often whispered about her attitude, but passengers usually let it slide. After all, a flight is temporary, a few hours of dealing with a difficult staff member, and then you land and move on. But this time, things would be different, as I am. Manny settled into his seat. He politely asked a question about storing his bag. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a traveler making sure his belongings were safe. But instead of offering help, the flight attendant sighed loudly, rolled her eyes, and snapped, "If you don't know how to put your bag away, maybe you shouldn't be flying at all." The words stung, not because of their meaning, but because of the sheer arrogance dripping from her voice. Several passengers turned their heads. They recognized disrespect when they heard it. Manny, however, didn't react. He simply smiled faintly and said, "Thank you," but that wasn't the end of it. As the boarding continued, the flight attendant passed by his row again, glancing at him as though he were somehow out of place in her pristine cabin. This time, she muttered under her breath, "Some people just don't belong here." She didn't think anyone heard her, but Manny did. And so did the man sitting across the aisle, who raised his eyebrows in disbelief. Little did she know, her arrogance had just set the stage for a lesson she would never forget. Because Manny Pacquiao had built his entire life around proving people wrong, but always with grace, never with cruelty. And this flight would soon become a perfect example of that. As the cabin door closed and the plane prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere should have been filled with the usual excitement and chatter. But in Manny Pacquiao's section, something felt different. The flight attendant's tone, sharp and dismissive, had already left a bad taste in the air. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, quietly wondering why she was targeting the quiet man sitting by the window. At first, Manny didn't let it bother him. He had faced much worse in his life: hunger, doubt, and the endless taunts of opponents who thought he would never succeed. A rude flight attendant was nothing compared to that. Still, there was a difference this time. She wasn't just being unhelpful, she was being openly disrespectful. And disrespect, Manny believed, should never be ignored. Not for his own sake, but because others were watching. When the beverage service began, things escalated. Manny politely asked for water. The attendant, without even making eye contact, slammed the plastic cup onto his tray. Water splashed onto his shirt. Gasps rippled through nearby rows. A young boy sitting behind Manny looked wide-eyed at his mother, who shook her head disapprovingly. "That was unnecessary," she whispered, but Manny remained calm. He dabbed the water with a napkin, smiled faintly, and said, "Thank you." The flight attendant smirked. "Of course, sir," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. It was clear she believed she was dealing with just another ordinary passenger, someone she could brush aside without consequence. But the truth was, other passengers were beginning to recognize him. A man 2 rows ahead nudged his wife and whispered, "Isn't that Manny Pacquiao, the boxer?" She squinted, leaned back for a better look, and nodded slowly. The murmurs spread. Phones discreetly tilted for photos. A few passengers exchanged incredulous looks. The world champion was being treated with contempt, and he wasn't saying a word in retaliation. As the flight continued, the tension only grew. When Manny adjusted his seat and pressed the call button for assistance, the attendant arrived with a sigh as though he were an inconvenience. "Yes? What now?" She snapped loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. Manny gestured politely. "I'm sorry to bother you, but the light above me isn't working. Could I move to another seat?" The attendant crossed her arms, her expression hard. "These seats are reserved for premium passengers," she said, coldly. "You're fine where you are." This time the disrespect was undeniable. A few passengers audibly gasped. One man muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Another woman whispered, "Does she even know who she's talking to?" But Manny, still calm, nodded and replied softly, "All right, thank you." The flight attendant walked away with her chin held high, as though she had won some unspoken battle. What she didn't realize was that her every word and gesture was being witnessed, not just by passengers but by her colleagues as well. One junior attendant nearby bit her lip, visibly uncomfortable with what she was seeing. But out of fear of confrontation, she stayed silent. For Queenie, Manny's daughter, such treatment once came from a teacher. For Manny, it was now from an airline employee. Different setting, same disrespect. And Manny knew the importance of handling it correctly. This wasn't just about him. If he overreacted, the story would become about an angry celebrity throwing his weight around. But if he handled it with dignity, the lesson would be far more powerful for everyone watching. By the halfway point of the flight, the whispers had spread across the cabin. More and more passengers realized they were witnessing something surreal. The global icon Manny Pacquiao, sitting humbly in his seat, being openly insulted by a flight attendant who didn't recognize him, or worse, didn't care. The breaking point came when meal service began. Manny politely asked, "Excuse me, may I have a vegetarian option?" The attendant smirked and replied loudly, "We don't serve special meals for people who think they're special." The entire row went silent. Forks froze mid-air. A young girl gasped and clutched her mother's arm. The insult wasn't subtle anymore. It was cruel, deliberate, and humiliating. This time Manny didn't just smile and let it go. He leaned back in his seat, folded his hands calmly, and said nothing. But inside, he had already made a decision. The way she had spoken, the way she had demeaned him publicly, it wasn't just disrespectful to him. It was a lesson waiting to be taught, not through anger or confrontation, but through action. And in just a few minutes, that lesson would change everything. The cabin had grown uncomfortably quiet after the attendant's cutting remark. Passengers who moments earlier were chatting softly over their meals now stared down at their trays, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The insult wasn't hidden anymore. It was loud, sharp, and cruel. "We don't serve special meals for people who think they're special." Those words hung in the air like poison. Manny Pacquiao, however, didn't flinch. He looked at her for a brief moment, his eyes calm but steady, then simply placed his napkin across his lap and said nothing. To the casual observer, it might have looked like he was ignoring the insult. But those who knew him, or who were starting to recognize him, could sense something deeper happening. Manny wasn't ignoring the disrespect. He was choosing his moment. The passengers, though, were not as restrained. A man 2 rows back muttered, "This is ridiculous. That's Manny Pacquiao she's talking to. Does she even know who he is?" A young woman across the aisle whispered, "Even if he wasn't famous, no one deserves to be treated that way." Heads nodded. Eyes followed the arrogant attendant as she strutted down the aisle, oblivious to the storm she was creating. Finally, the murmurs became too loud to ignore. A teenage boy pulled out his phone and whispered to his mother, "I'm recording this. People need to see how she's treating him." His mother hesitated but then nodded, realizing this was more than just rudeness. It was a public humiliation. The tension reached its peak when the attendant returned with the trash cart. She stopped at Manny's row, glanced at him with a smirk, and said loudly enough for several rows to hear, "Make sure you don't spill, again. We don't want another mess, do we?" That was it. The line had been crossed. Manny slowly looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. His voice, though soft, carried weight. "Ma'am, I've tried to be patient and respectful with you, but your words and actions have gone too far. I may look ordinary to you, but the way you've treated me, and the way you've spoken, is not how anyone deserves to be treated." The surrounding passengers went silent. You could hear the hum of the engines and the faint clinking of cups several rows away. The arrogant smile faded slightly from the attendant's face, replaced by a flicker of unease. Before she could respond, another passenger spoke up. A businessman in a suit leaned forward from the row behind Manny and said firmly, "He's right. We've all been watching how you've spoken to him, and it's unacceptable." Another voice chimed in, this time from a mother traveling with her children. "I don't know who you think you're talking to, but this isn't professional. It's cruel." One by one, passengers began voicing their disapproval. The murmurs had turned into open confrontation. The junior attendant who had been watching nervously finally stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Sir, I'm so sorry for how you've been treated. This is not how we're supposed to serve our passengers." She looked directly at her colleague, eyes wide with disbelief, and then came the moment the arrogant attendant hadn't expected. A man seated near the front stood up and turned around. He raised his phone, showing a live feed. "Do you even realize," he said loudly, "that you've been insulting Senator Manny Pacquiao, one of the most respected men in the Philippines, and one of the greatest boxers in history?" Gasps erupted across the cabin. The passengers who hadn't yet recognized him now leaned forward, whispering, pointing, and shaking their heads in shock. The arrogant attendant's face turned pale. She glanced at Manny, then back at the passengers, as if suddenly realizing the gravity of her actions. Manny, still calm, simply folded his hands and said softly, "It's not about who I am. It's about respect. Every person deserves it, whether they're a senator, a boxer, or just an ordinary traveler." That statement struck deeper than any punch he had ever thrown in the ring. The cabin filled with nods, murmurs of agreement, and quiet applause from a few rows. The balance of power had shifted completely. The arrogant flight attendant, once so confident, now looked cornered, her arrogance dissolving into panic. The breaking point had been reached, and there would be no turning back. What happened in the next few minutes would determine not just the end of this flight, but the end of her career. The cabin felt like a courtroom, and the arrogant flight attendant was suddenly standing trial. Only minutes earlier, she had been in control, dismissing, insulting, and belittling a man she assumed was powerless. But now the tables had turned. Passengers were no longer silent observers. They were witnesses, and many of them were ready to testify. One passenger, an elderly woman seated a few rows ahead, raised her hand slightly as if asking permission to speak. "I saw everything," she said clearly. "From the very beginning, this man was polite to you, and yet you treated him with disrespect. That's not how anyone should be treated, famous or not." Another man added firmly, "I recorded part of it on my phone. If the airline needs to see what happened, they will." The arrogant attendant shifted uncomfortably, her confident posture beginning to crumble. She tried to force a smile, but her voice shook when she said, "It was just a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" The businessman behind Manny cut her off. "You rolled your eyes at him, you splashed water on him, and we all heard your words about people who think they're special. Don't try to rewrite what happened. We were here." The junior attendant, who had been silent until now, finally stepped forward with courage. "Sir," she said to Manny, "on behalf of the crew, I want to apologize for everything. This is not how our airline treats passengers. You've shown remarkable patience, and I'm deeply sorry for what you've experienced." Manny nodded gently, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you. I don't want trouble. I only believe that everyone deserves respect, not because of who they are, but because they are human." The simplicity of his words silenced the cabin. It was a reminder that true dignity doesn't need to be loud. It speaks through humility, even in the face of humiliation. The commotion eventually reached the ears of the cabin supervisor, who rushed down the aisle to assess the situation. She quickly recognized the tension in the air, the stern faces of passengers and the trembling figure of her colleague. Turning toward Manny first, she bowed slightly in apology. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for any disrespect you've received. On this flight, please know this does not reflect the values of our airline." Passengers murmured in approval. Some nodded, clearly relieved that the situation was finally being addressed. The supervisor then faced the arrogant attendant. Her tone was firm, authoritative. "Step aside. I need to speak with you privately." But the passengers weren't willing to let it slide so easily. One woman spoke up. "With all due respect, ma'am, this wasn't private. She humiliated him in front of everyone. We think it should be addressed in front of everyone, too." The supervisor hesitated. She knew the passengers were right. This wasn't a situation that could be smoothed over with quiet words in the galley. Too many people had seen, too many phones had recorded. Transparency was the only way forward. Taking a deep breath, the supervisor addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to acknowledge what has happened here. No passenger should ever be disrespected on our flights. The behavior you witnessed from a member of our crew is unacceptable. I assure you it will be reported and acted upon immediately." The cabin filled with soft applause. It wasn't just for the supervisor's words, but for the man who had endured humiliation without retaliation. Manny simply bowed his head slightly, acknowledging their support. The arrogant attendant, meanwhile, stood frozen, her face pale. The confidence she had flaunted earlier was gone. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, but the sight of dozens of disapproving eyes stopped her. She lowered her gaze and stepped back, realizing that she had already lost. The supervisor personally served Manny a proper meal, apologizing once again. "Please, enjoy this, sir. And thank you for handling this with such patience. Most people would have reacted very differently." Manny smiled faintly. "Anger never solves anything. Respect does." Those words echoed through the rows, leaving an impression far deeper than any confrontation could have. From that moment onward, the arrogant attendant was relieved of her duties for the remainder of the flight. She sat quietly in the jump seat. At the back of the plane, her arrogance now replaced with silence. The rest of the crew treated Manny with kindness and extra care, not because he was famous, but because he had earned their respect through his composure. And for the passengers, it was a story they knew they would never forget. A story of arrogance brought low, and humility shining brighter than ever. What none of them knew yet was that this incident wouldn't just end in the skies. It would follow the arrogant attendant all the way to the ground, and cost her the very career she had taken for granted. When the plane finally touched down, the passengers were eager to leave, but the story of what had happened mid-air was still fresh in everyone's mind. People whispered about it as they gathered their bags, and more than a few glanced back at Manny Pacquiao with a newfound respect. He had endured humiliation with patience, and in doing so, he had exposed the arrogance of someone who thought power came from a uniform rather than character. The arrogant flight attendant, however, could not escape the weight of her actions. As passengers disembarked, several stopped to quietly tell the cabin supervisor that they intended to file formal complaints. One man held up his phone and said, "I have everything recorded. The airline should see this." A mother traveling with her children added, "She wasn't just rude, she was cruel. No one should be treated like that." The supervisor nodded, her expression tense. She knew the matter was serious. Once the last passenger had left, she approached Manny directly. "Senator Pacquiao, thank you for your patience. I assure you, this incident will not be ignored. Would you like to file a formal report?" Manny shook his head gently. "I don't need to. The passengers have already spoken. That is enough." His response was simple, but it carried weight. He didn't need revenge. Truth had already done its work. Meanwhile, the arrogant attendant sat stiffly in the crew's jump seat, her face pale. She had avoided eye contact the entire descent, but now there was no avoiding the consequences. The supervisor summoned her to the galley and spoke in a low but firm tone. "You will remain here until ground management arrives. Your behavior has been documented by passengers, by myself, and even by recordings. This is not something we can overlook." Her lips trembled as she tried to defend herself. "I didn't know who he was." The supervisor interrupted sharply. "That's exactly the point. It doesn't matter if he was Manny Pacquiao or any ordinary passenger. Your behavior was unprofessional, disrespectful, and public. This isn't about who he is, it's about what you did." The words hit harder than any reprimand she had ever received. For the first time, she realized that the uniform she wore didn't protect her. Instead, it now made her actions look worse, because as a representative of the airline, her arrogance had reflected poorly on everyone. By the time airport management arrived at the gate, the matter had already spread. Several passengers had uploaded snippets of the incident online. Within minutes, social media was buzzing. Titles like "Flight Attendant Insults Manny Pacquiao on Flight" and "Arrogant Crew Member Exposed" began to circulate. The officials listened carefully as passengers gave their statements. Phones were shown, recordings played. The evidence was overwhelming. When they finally turned to the attendant, her excuses fell flat. "I was stressed," she muttered. "It was a long flight." But one official shook his head firmly. "Stress is never an excuse for cruelty. Your actions were deliberate. You didn't just lose your composure. You lost the trust of the passengers you were meant to serve. And just like that, her career collapsed. She was escorted away from the gate, no longer in control, no longer walking with the arrogance that had defined her only hours before. Passengers who had witnessed everything whispered among themselves, some satisfied, others shaking their heads at the tragic fall from pride to punishment. Manny, on the other hand, quietly made his way through the terminal. Cameras flashed as news reporters who had caught wind of the incident tried to get his reaction. True to his nature, he smiled humbly and said only, "Respect is for everyone, that's all." His words traveled farther than any scandal could. While the flight attendant lost her job, Manny gained even more admiration for the way he carried himself. In the end, the consequence was clear. Arrogance had cost the flight attendant her career, but humility had once again elevated Manny Pacquiao. In the eyes of the world, airports are places where thousands of stories unfold every single day. But for the passengers of that flight, the story they carried with them was one they would retell for years. The day arrogance tried to humiliate Manny Pacquiao, and humility answered with dignity. By the time the incident made headlines, the world had already drawn its conclusions. News outlets replayed the recordings again and again, the arrogant smirk of the flight attendant, the cutting words meant to belittle, and then the calm, steady response of a man who could have lashed out, but chose not to. The contrast was undeniable. In Davao, cafes, offices, and living rooms across the Philippines, and even far beyond, people were talking. Some admired Manny for not using his fame or power to intimidate the attendant. Others were struck by the way passengers rallied behind him, proving that ordinary people still stand up for what's right when the moment demands it. And parents, especially, pointed to the story as a lesson for their children. This is how you deal with disrespect, not with anger but with composure. Meanwhile, the arrogant flight attendant's fate became a cautionary tale. Dismissed from her position, she disappeared from the airline industry altogether. For her, the humiliation wasn't just losing her job. It was realizing that her arrogance had been witnessed by hundreds, recorded by dozens, and broadcast to millions. She had wanted to feel powerful by belittling someone else. Instead, she had destroyed her own career. But Manny's response reminded everyone of something far more important. True strength doesn't come from titles, money, or fame. True strength is shown in the way you treat others, even when they don't treat you well. In a later interview, when asked why he stayed so calm, Manny smiled gently and said, "Because respect is free. You don't lose anything by giving it, but you lose everything by taking it away." Those words resonated deeply. They were simple, yet they cut to the heart of what had happened. For the passengers, it became a story not just about Manny, but about themselves. Many admitted later that they had felt anger bubbling inside them when the attendant spoke cruelly. They wanted to shout back, to defend him. But it was Manny's example that reminded them that dignity is louder than rage. In fact, one passenger later wrote in a blog post, "I realized in that moment that silence can be stronger than shouting, and calm can be more powerful than anger." Pacquiao taught us that. The moral of the story was clear. Arrogance is fragile. It may look strong on the outside, but it crumbles the moment it's challenged by integrity. Humility, on the other hand, is unshakable. It doesn't need to prove itself with harsh words or loud actions. It speaks in patience, in kindness, and in quiet strength. For the airline, the incident became a turning point too. New training sessions were introduced, reminding every staff member that passengers are not just customers, they are people. Each deserves respect, regardless of their status, their appearance, or their background. The company wanted to make sure such arrogance never tarnished their service again. And for Manny, he walked away with nothing gained materially, yet everything gained morally. His image wasn't just that of a champion in the boxing ring or a senator in politics. It was of a man who lived by his principles, even in the face of insult. That's why for millions of Filipinos he remained more than just an athlete. He was a symbol of humility in victory and dignity in adversity. So what should we take away from this story? Perhaps it's this: respect costs nothing, but it is priceless. Arrogance may shine for a moment, but humility endures forever. The way we treat others, especially when no one is watching, defines who we truly are. To every viewer hearing this, remember, you don't need to be a world champion to act with dignity. You don't need to be a senator to demand respect. You only need to remember that kindness and humility are stronger than arrogance and cruelty. And that is the lesson from the skies that day. Because in the end, it wasn't Manny Pacquiao's fame that won the battle. It was his humility.